You need to please.
And I'm the chair of our department there, Dr. Gilbert. That's Rebecca. She's a recent Ph.D. Graduate in our department.
Good morning. Very nice to meet you.
Ready to go, whenever you're ready.
Okay.
Yeah, that's the, Dr. Gilbert, can we get a 1 hour ethics, PD?
You can, yes, you can. Do you mind if I turn the lights on?
That's fine. That's
That way that light that's flashing won't seem like it's flashing. Okay, well, thank you all very much for coming. This is the first canon in our code of ethics. It's to hold paramount the health, safety, and welfare of the public, which seems like a simple thing to do, but I'm going to tell you a story about this and how difficult that really is.
I think the clicker has to be.
The pointer?
Oops.
The pointer?
Yeah, the pointer.
You can plug in here.
Don't I have to say remote control?
No, yeah, you can plug in here, that dongle.
That's okay. I'll just use the keyboard.
The keyboard?
Yep.
Yeah, so if you connect it here, it will work. If you connect it here, the dongle. Yeah.
I'll use the keyboard.
Cause I'm sharing it from the PowerPoint on my computer. So I
See,
don't.
it works.
Yeah, so you ready for the story? Okay. So this is a picture of extending almost 10 miles up into the sky as this massive storm came into the Gulf of Mexico. So right here, it's just by the southern tip of Florida. It got into the Gulf of Mexico over the warm waters of the Gulf of Mexico. It intensified, it grew. It pushed the storm surge up onto the Gulf Coast, just east of New Orleans, Louisiana. And people drowned in the flooding in their attics. And the storm was Hurricane Betsy. And the year was 1965. And I was 4 months old. And the people of New Orleans said, we don't want this to happen again. And the government said, we're going to make sure this never happens again. And we, the engineers, were charged with figuring out how to make it so that this would never happen again. And then 40 years later, almost to the date, it happened again. And it was even worse. More people drowned in the flooding in their attics. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you the story of what happened in Hurricane Katrina. And what I hope you, number one, is how difficult it is to hold paramount the safety, health, and welfare of the public. Easy to say, it's difficult to do. The second thing I hope you get out of this is how important it is to do that. In New Orleans, when you take away clean water and you take away power and you take away communications and you take away transportation systems and you take away shelter, chaos occurs. It didn't take more than a day for what was part of a developed country to look like something that was entirely undeveloped. So it was very quick when you take away that infrastructure, what we do as civil engineers. So here's the setting for our story. This is New Orleans, Louisiana. It is basically best described as being backwards and upside down. So it's a crazy place, first of all, because it's out in the middle of the ocean. The north shore of Lake Pontchartrain, which is 20 to 30 miles of downtown New Orleans, is actually the coastline. So we're out more than 30 miles out into the ocean. The only reason this land is here right now is because not very long ago, 5,000 years ago, the Mississippi River moved to its current course and dumped a bunch of sediment off the coastline and built up this land. We've since channelized the river and prevented it from flooding, so we're no longer building that land, and that land is all slowly sinking back into the ocean. Maybe not in my lifetime or your lifetime, but sometime geologically, relatively soon, this land is all going to be back in the ocean. And not only is it out in the middle of the ocean, it's completely surrounded by water out in the middle of the ocean. So the ocean is to the west, the ocean is to the south, the ocean is to the east, Lake Borgne is the Gulf of Mexico, and it's to the north, Lake Pontchartrain is connected to the Gulf of Mexico. And you got the Mississippi River running through it, meandering all over the place as it runs through here. The distance from New Orleans to the mouth of the Mississippi River, any guesses how long that is? This is the port of New Orleans, right? It's a port, it's on the coast. Any guesses how long it is from the Mississippi River?
10 miles.
That's 100 miles. It's still 100 more miles down the Mississippi River before you get to its mouth at the Gulf of Mexico. So this land is perilously situated. The reason that it was settled where it is because this is where the land got high enough that you could have some development. The French Quarter, which goes back several hundreds of years, is right on the banks of the Mississippi River because that's the highest ground. And there's not much higher ground for another 100 miles before you get to the mouth of the Mississippi River. So it makes sense geographically that New Orleans is where it's located. Not only does it have the river running through it and the ocean all around it, but humans have made more access to water. So first of all, there's the Gulf Intercoastal Waterway, also known as the GIWW. This is a series of canals that runs all along the Gulf Coast to provide navigation on the coast. There's the Inner Harbor Navigation Canal, also known as the Industrial Canal or IHNC. That is a canal that was created to connect Lake Pontchartrain to the Mississippi River. So there are locks along that canal, so you can go from ocean level, Lake Pontchartrain, up to the level of the Mississippi River, which is maybe 15 feet, 20 feet above sea level at this location with ships. There's a number of outfall canals. So this area is out in the middle of the ocean. It's very wet. In order to develop the land, they're constantly pumping and keeping the water level down, and they're pushing that water into these outfall canals. So there's 3 outfall canals north of downtown Louisiana that are going to be part of our story. To the left is the 17th Street Canal, and then there's 2 more canals as you go to the east. And if that isn't enough water, in the 1960s, the Corps of Engineers built another canal to get to the Gulf of Mexico that shortened the distance. So instead of being 100 miles, it was like 60 miles along what's known as the Mississippi Gulf Outlet, also known as Mr. Go locally. So there's water everywhere. There's water throughout the city. And because the Mississippi River is meandering all over the place, what's west and east is really confusing when you're in New Orleans. So you typically think of the river running from north to south, and the west bank would be on the west side and the east bank would be on the east side. But this thing's going all over the place. So for example, the Orleans East Bank Parish is almost entirely to the west of the Orleans West Bank Parish. So it's kind of an upside down place. And not only that, it's almost entirely below sea level. 80% of the land is below sea level. So this is a cross section drawn from the French Quarter on the high banks of the Mississippi River, going straight north to Lake Pontchartrain. On the north side of this cross section is about where the University of New Orleans is located. And that purple line is sea level, and along this cross section, just like throughout this area, about 80% of it is below sea level. So for the hydraulic engineers in the room, that is how they are connected there. This is the protagonist in our story. This is called the Hurricane Protection System. This was conceived of after Hurricane Betsy in 1965. It was authorized by the federal government in 1966. It was designed so that Hurricane Betsy would never happen again. The Corps of Engineers was charged with designing and building this hurricane protection system. It is a series of 350 miles of walls and levees that are there to keep the storm surge from coming into the city. So 350 miles, that's like from Jackson to New Orleans and back again. That's how big this system is, and it's got all sorts of pieces and parts to it. So it's not only a huge system, it's a very complicated system. Those yellow lines represent all the various levees and floodwalls that make up that hurricane protection system. It's primarily earthen levees, so what's shown in the upper corner there with earth that's been compacted in lifts and building up the ground surface. When you got in close to the urban areas, in order to make the levees that were there in 1965 higher, you would have to make them wider, and if you made them wider, you were going to be taking people's property. So in order to avoid taking people's property, they would build walls up on top of the existing system. So in the lower part, you see one of these walls under construction as part of the original hurricane protection system. These, for the most part, are steel sheet piles that are driven down about 25 feet below the top of the levee. They stick up about 5 feet above the top of the levee, and then a concrete facade is cast around the steel sheet pile, which is what you see. That's what that concrete that you see making up that wall is. They're called eye walls. There are some walls that were even more robust with deep foundations going down about 120 feet. But for the most part, these eye walls that you see in the lower right-hand corner were the walls that made up the hurricane protection system. This was a very complicated system, 350 miles. It was authorized in 1966. In 2005, when Hurricane Katrina came along, it was only 80% finished. So they still had 20% of it to go in 2005. Fortunately, the part that wasn't yet finished was on the west bank of the Mississippi River, and Hurricane Katrina's path took it on the east bank of the Mississippi River. So the city in many ways was spared significantly, because if the 20% that hadn't been built yet was on the east bank, it would have been a lot worse in Hurricane Katrina. Here is the antagonist in our story. This is Hurricane Katrina. It took almost the exact same path as Hurricane Betsy. So here's where that photograph was of Hurricane Betsy's eye wall. It got over the warm waters of the Gulf of Mexico. It intensified, it grew. If anybody tells you that Hurricane Katrina wasn't that bad of a storm, that is not correct at all. It was a monster of a storm. It almost filled the Gulf of Mexico. It has some of the most powerful winds that we have seen in the Gulf of Mexico. The storm surge in Hurricane Katrina was unprecedented. So in 1969, in Hurricane Camille, which also took a similar path, but was a much smaller storm, we had recorded the biggest, highest storm surge anywhere in the history of the Gulf of Mexico in Mississippi, on the coast, just east of the state line with Louisiana by Bay St. Louis, and the storm surge was 23 feet above sea level. In Hurricane Katrina, at that same location, it was over 33 feet above sea level. So anybody that says Hurricane Katrina wasn't that bad and all the problems that happened were because of poor designs, that's not correct. Hurricane Katrina was a monster. We worked on understanding storm surges and how they're created. They developed this supercomputer model that runs on a supercomputer in parallel. In 2006, when we were working on it, it would take a day of computation time to model 1 day of real time for a storm making its way through the Gulf of Mexico and up onto the Gulf Coast. This model is called ADCIRC. There's people from all over here that were a part of developing ADCIRC. But that model, once we had this model working and it was calibrated with Katrina, and then we had Hurricane Gustav, and then we had Hurricane Ike in 2008, and they got it all calibrated, they started simulating storms. And, you know, coming up with worst case storms, the size of it, the path of it, the intensity of it. And in doing that, they were unable to create anything worse in terms of storm surge than Hurricane Katrina. So even in their imagination, even making things up with what might happen, Hurricane Katrina was as bad as anything that they could conceive of. Is there anything we need to do there, Amber?
I'm gonna probably put, my other meeting link in the chat, because this is gonna end in 10 minutes. So, you can give me one moment.
While she's doing that, I'll answer any questions you have so far.
Thank you.
So if you're at a party and somebody says, oh, Hurricane Katrina wasn't that bad, that's not true at all.
Yeah, I was here when Katrina hit, was here in Florida City, in my house, half of the roof was damaged.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was really scary.
Yeah, I was in New Orleans the Thursday. Hurricane Katrina made landfall on Monday morning. So that Thursday I was in New Orleans. We were supposed to go offshore to see some platforms in the Gulf of Mexico. Because during Hurricane Ivan in 2004, there had been quite a bit of damage to the offshore structures. So we were going out to see some of it. We were meeting with the Minerals Management Service in Metairie, Louisiana. It was on Thursday afternoon that we decided to cancel the trip because Hurricane Katrina had just turned into the, or it was looking like it was going to come into the Gulf of Mexico. And so we ended up canceling our trip. I fortunately got out that night, Thursday night. You know, the people that I was with at lunch that day, all of them lost their homes. And we had no idea. It's Thursday afternoon, and in the news, there was something about a hurricane, but it wasn't that big of a deal. So between Thursday afternoon and early Monday morning, late Sunday night, things just changed dramatically in New Orleans.
I have a question.
Yeah, and there's a question over here too. Go ahead.
So New Orleans is sinking, so like, is there a rate, like how much elevation is sinking, something like that?
Yeah, no, because so there are some areas that I'll give you an example. So on the 17th Street Canal, there's a wall, a flood wall, an eye wall. It was designed in 1993. It was built in 1995. Between 1995 and 2005, it went down 3 inches at that location. The bigger part of that, actually it went down 0.3 feet, not 3 inches, 0.3 feet. So that's like 4 inches. But when they conceived of the hurricane protection system in the late 1960s, you know, when you design something like that, you say, okay, well, here's where the ground is, and this is how high the levees are going to need to be, and this is how high the walls are going to need to be. And all of the cost estimates and everything that gets sent to Congress to get authorization for funding is based on how high it needs to be relative to where the ground is. And the ground is going down. So the Corps of Engineers, you know, if they had built this within 5 years or 3 years or whatever they thought they were going to be able to do it in the early 1970s, the amount of ground wouldn't have been that big of a deal, but because the construction spread out over 40 years and they still weren't done with it, they continuously had to make decisions about, do we keep using the benchmarks from the 1960s or do we adjust them? And they made a very conscious decision in the mid-1980s to continue using the benchmarks, not to adjust them from the late 1960s, because that's how they got the funding authorized. If they went back in the 1980s and said, by the way, the ground has gone down another foot, we need even more money, they were afraid they weren't going to get it. So this is a good example of ethics. The engineers didn't talk to a bunch of people. They just thought, well, we need to solve this problem. The ground's going down. Congress isn't going to give us any more money. We're going to just keep using the same benchmarks. And their terminology, this is classic Corps of Engineers, was they were going to close the perimeter. So they were going to use the funding they had, use the heights above ground surface that they had designed it for, and close the perimeter. And then they were going to go back to Congress and try to get more money to raise it up to account for the ground subsidence. So at the location of the 17th Street Canal eye wall, when they built it, its as-built elevation was 1.6 feet below where it was supposed to be because of that much subsidence from the late 1960s to the mid-1990s. So by the time Hurricane Katrina came along, and this is crazy, this is hydraulics, right? It's all about water elevation. The system at that location was almost 2 feet below where it was supposed to be relative to sea level. And, you know, there's been a lot of controversy about this. Did the Corps of Engineers make a bad decision, a good decision? I don't know, it's complicated. While it went down 1.6 feet there are other locations where it went down much less, so it's not consistent. There are other locations where it went down more than 3 feet in the 40 years. So it's highly variable. It seems to be accelerating, which makes sense because we stopped building the land, and so it's, you know, it's slowly moving back into the ocean. In geologic time, it's very rapidly moving back into the ocean. So it's a challenge, and it's a challenge all along the Gulf Coast. In Texas, we have this problem because the benchmarks are moving down. And, you know, you can't, after Katrina, they found where the most stable benchmark was that they would have to tie everything into to make sure that they were using absolute elevations. And it's in Cairo, Illinois. It's 600 miles up the river. So the delta of the Mississippi River is that big that to get to bedrock that they could count on, they had to go 600 miles up the river. So imagine every time you shoot an elevation, you're tying it back to something 600 miles away. It's not practical. So it's an interesting challenge. You know, the system that's now out there, they've tried to estimate how much subsidence there was going to be over the next 100 years, 50 years, and 100 years, and tried to account for that in the system. So at the end of its design life, it's still above where they wanted it to be. But it's a challenge, and who knows what happens then. So that gets us to 2050 or 2100 now. So it's a real challenge. It's a dynamic environment. All geologic settings are dynamic. I think we as humans want everything to be static, but it's not.
Thank you, Dr. Gilbert. One sec.
Yes,
I'm going to switch the audio. I'm going to log out of this Zoom and log into another Zoom. So I want you to ask your question once I log into the other Zoom, if that's okay.
Okay, so should I question it right now or after?
After. I'm about to log out right now. So everybody, I'm logged in.
We talk about football?
Yeah, talk about whatever you want while I go ahead and log out. All right, I'm ending this meeting, everybody. Please refer to the chat. I dropped a link and then a meeting ID and a passcode in the chat, and I need you to click the link, but if they ask you for a meeting ID and passcode, which sometimes the password doesn't work with the link for whatever reason, type in the meeting ID and passcode that I put there. So now I'm going to end this meeting and sign into the other one. Thank you all. All right, end meeting for all.